When Donald Trump first emerged victorious in a state he barely managed to secure, the celebration was not just about numbers on a board but about the symbolism of winning ground that had long been seen as difficult terrain. That narrow triumph gave his campaign a sense of momentum and credibility, proving he could flip regions where the odds seemed stacked against him. Yet beneath the surface of such a win lies an uncomfortable truth: victories achieved by razor-thin margins are victories balanced on fragile ground. They represent the kind of support that can be as easily lost as it was gained, subject to even the smallest shifts in voter sentiment, economic trends, or changes in public trust. A slim lead is never a cushion but rather a warning sign, because it means that the candidate never had a secure foundation of loyalty, only a temporary alignment of circumstances that fell just enough in their favor. For Trump, this fragility has become especially evident as new political realities begin to unfold in the very same state where he once celebrated. That narrow margin of victory, which his supporters hailed as a testament to his power, is now the source of his greatest vulnerability. When a politician relies on barely winning, every future election cycle in that region becomes a battlefield of uncertainty, where even a modest decline in enthusiasm or a slight surge of opposition could change everything. A close win is like walking a tightrope: one wrong step, one unpopular decision, or one unexpected development can cause a fall. In politics, where the winds of public opinion shift constantly, relying on such precarious ground is dangerous. The fragility of victory becomes clear when examining the mechanics of how such states are won. Campaigns invest enormous amounts of time and resources into micro-targeting voters, rallying every possible supporter, and ensuring turnout is maximized in crucial districts. Trump's campaign did exactly that, focusing heavily on rural enthusiasm, disaffected voters, and promises of change that resonated with enough people to tip the scales. But these same strategies highlight how vulnerable the win truly was, because it relied not on a broad coalition with staying power but on squeezing every last drop of support from a base that was already stretched thin. When a candidate wins by the narrowest of margins, it means that nearly half of the electorate was opposed to them, and that razor-thin victory can easily reverse if the opposition organizes more effectively the next time around. The psychology of slim victories also carries implications. Supporters may celebrate, but opponents feel emboldened, knowing they only need to sway a small percentage of voters to change the outcome. This breeds determination in rival campaigns and energizes grassroots movements. Trump's narrow win in that state was a wake-up call not only for his party but for his opponents, who immediately recognized that the state was not firmly in his column. Instead of discouragement, the close result created motivation for challengers, fueling voter registration drives, grassroots activism, and local organizing designed to flip the state in the next cycle. What looked like a success for Trump at first was, in reality, an early warning that the state would remain contested and unstable. The fragility of a close victory is amplified by demographic shifts, changing political attitudes, and the influence of national events. Even small changes, such as young voters coming of age, increased turnout from minority communities, or suburban districts swinging slightly, can turn the tide. A narrow win does not leave room for error, because any of these factors, no matter how minor, can undo the fragile coalition that allowed the victory in the first place. For Trump, whose political identity is tied strongly to loyalty and strength, the idea that one of his hard-fought states could be slipping away is a particularly bitter pill to swallow. It exposes the limits of his influence and the vulnerability of his movement when faced with even modest opposition gains. When a leader secures power through slim margins, it often forces them to double down on divisive tactics in order to maintain their base. Trump has leaned heavily into polarizing rhetoric, believing that energizing his core supporters is enough to sustain him. But this approach neglects the reality that razor-thin victories require expansion, not contraction. To hold such a fragile lead, a candidate must reach beyond their core and appeal to moderates, independents, and swing voters who make the difference in tight contests. Trump's strategy, however, has often been to deepen loyalty among his most passionate supporters at the expense of broader appeal, leaving him exposed in states where margins matter most. The fragility of victory also means that external factors outside a candidate's control weigh more heavily. Economic downturns, controversial court rulings, natural disasters, or national scandals can each sway enough voters in one direction to alter the outcome. In states won by wide margins, these factors may not matter as much, because the winning candidate has room to absorb some loss. But in states where the margin is razor-thin, these shifts can be devastating. A rise in unemployment, frustration with healthcare, or dissatisfaction with leadership during a crisis could be the difference between holding the state or losing it. This is why slim victories carry with them not only celebration but constant anxiety, because the candidate knows that the slightest headwind could undo what was achieved. Trump's case illustrates this dynamic in full. His narrow win gave him the symbolic power of claiming a difficult state, but the victory was never a solid foundation. Instead, it was a fragile foothold that now seems to be eroding under the weight of changing opinions, rising opposition, and the unpredictability of modern politics. For every voter he convinced in that cycle, there was another who remained unconvinced or deeply opposed, and that tension has not disappeared. If anything, it has intensified over time as new issues have emerged and as opponents have organized more effectively. The idea of fragility in victory also reveals a deeper truth about democracy: it thrives on constant participation and change. No state, no margin, no victory can ever be taken for granted. Trump's narrow success should have been treated as a temporary advantage requiring long-term strategy and coalition building, but instead it has become a reminder of how fleeting political wins can be. Every election brings with it new challenges, new voices, and new dynamics that reshape the playing field, and leaders who ignore the fragility of their past victories risk watching them vanish before their eyes. When Donald Trump secured his narrow victory in that battleground state, it was not only a political surprise but also a sign that he had tapped into frustrations that many politicians had overlooked. Yet, as time passes, the political landscape in that very state has begun to shift in ways that are unsettling for him and his movement. Politics is never static, and the same dynamics that once worked in his favor are now being challenged by new realities, changing demographics, and evolving priorities among voters. The state that once tilted ever so slightly toward Trump is showing evidence of pulling away, and this shift in the political climate underscores how fleeting momentum can be when it is built on a fragile base rather than deep, enduring loyalty. The clearest indication of this changing landscape comes from polling data, which reflects subtle but meaningful changes in public opinion. Numbers that once favored Trump, or at least gave him a fighting chance, now reveal declining support and growing dissatisfaction. Even a small drop in approval ratings can be devastating in a state he barely won, and the polls show precisely that: a slow erosion of his grip on voters who once gave him the benefit of the doubt. These shifts often come from independents and suburban moderates, groups who are highly sensitive to national controversies, policy missteps, and the overall tone of leadership. Trump's style, while energizing to his loyal base, has increasingly alienated these voters, making it harder for him to maintain the coalition that secured his narrow margin of victory. Another factor reshaping the political landscape in this state is demographic change. Younger generations are entering the electorate with priorities and values that differ significantly from older voters. Issues such as climate change, social justice, and economic fairness carry more weight for them, and many do not resonate with Trump's approach or rhetoric. At the same time, minority populations are growing, particularly in urban and suburban areas, and these communities have often leaned away from Trump's policies and messaging. As these populations become a larger share of the voting base, the balance of power shifts gradually but decisively, eroding the advantage that once allowed him to squeak out a win. Suburban areas, which were once competitive ground for Republicans, have also undergone dramatic transformations. These regions, filled with middle-class families, professionals, and increasingly diverse populations, have become hotbeds of opposition to Trump's style of politics. The combination of cultural shifts, educational levels, and dissatisfaction with divisive rhetoric has tilted the suburbs toward his opponents. In a state where victory depended on winning just enough suburban support to offset urban dominance and rural enthusiasm, this change is critical. Even a modest shift in suburban voting patterns can swing thousands of votes, creating a ripple effect that undermines Trump's chances in future elections. The political landscape is also shaped by the strength of local grassroots movements and party organizations. Following Trump's narrow victory, opposition groups in the state redoubled their efforts, organizing voter registration drives, mobilizing younger voters, and building a more effective ground game. The energy and determination among these groups have created a more resilient opposition that is harder for Trump to overcome with rallies and slogans alone. Grassroots energy has translated into higher turnout in local elections, school board races, and state-level contests, all of which suggest that the state is moving away from being as receptive to Trump's message as it once was. National events further influence the state's shifting political dynamics. Major crises such as the pandemic, economic struggles, or controversies over policy decisions have a magnified effect in states that are politically divided. While Trump's most loyal supporters remain steadfast, those who were only cautiously supportive have grown more skeptical as they weigh leadership against results. States that are already finely balanced tend to react strongly to national turbulence, and this battleground has proven no exception. The more controversies pile up, the more difficult it becomes for Trump to sustain the narrow coalition that worked in his favor before. Another element in the changing landscape is the rise of alternative Republican voices within the state. While Trump maintains strong influence over his party, there are signs that some conservatives and moderates within the state want to move in a different direction, seeking leaders who represent the party's values without the chaos that often accompanies Trump's style. This creates tension within the Republican base itself, as some voters may remain loyal to Trump while others begin to consider alternatives. Such divisions weaken his standing and highlight the fragile nature of his hold on the state. The influence of media and communication also plays a role in shaping these shifts. During his initial rise, Trump dominated headlines and set the tone for political discourse, but the media landscape has diversified since then. Younger voters rely heavily on digital platforms, social media influencers, and independent outlets rather than traditional sources. The narratives they consume often paint a less favorable view of Trump, reinforcing skepticism and reducing his ability to shape opinion as effectively as before. The changing ways people engage with political content create an environment where his once dominant presence no longer carries the same weight. The state's economy is another point of contention shaping its politics. Voters who once backed Trump because of promises of economic revitalization are now evaluating whether those promises were fulfilled. In areas hit hard by job losses, inflation, or declining industries, frustration can quickly turn into opposition. While Trump continues to tout economic achievements, many voters are more focused on their immediate struggles than on national statistics. If they feel left behind, they are less likely to maintain loyalty, particularly in a state where every vote counts. Ultimately, the changing political landscape in this battleground state reflects broader national trends. Polarization has deepened, but so too has voter engagement, especially among groups that feel directly impacted by Trump's policies. What once seemed like a surprising success for him is now a reminder of how volatile and competitive the state truly is. The coalition that delivered his narrow victory is fracturing, and new voices, new demographics, and new movements are rising to challenge his hold. The battleground has become even more contested, and the shifting dynamics illustrate that yesterday's strategies will not guarantee tomorrow's wins. When Donald Trump narrowly won that crucial battleground state, the victory carried more weight than just its electoral votes. It symbolized momentum, energy, and the ability to flip ground that had long been contested. But now, as troubling news emerges from that very state, the implications go far beyond its borders. What happens in one battleground rarely stays confined there. In the complex machinery of American politics, a slip in one state can trigger a ripple effect across the map, influencing voter perceptions, campaign strategies, and the morale of supporters and opponents alike. That is why the warning signs coming from this state are not just a localized setback but a potential signal of broader challenges for Trump's national ambitions. National politics is a game of momentum, and momentum is fragile. When a candidate appears to be losing ground in a state they barely won before, it raises doubts about their strength in similar battlegrounds. If the formula that delivered a slim victory in one place no longer works, opponents are emboldened to believe it won't work elsewhere either. States with similar demographics, similar suburban shifts, or similar patterns of urban versus rural turnout begin to look more competitive. A loss of confidence in one state can quickly expand to a sense that the electoral map itself is shifting, undermining the narrative of inevitability that Trump has often relied on to project strength. The national implications are also tied to how the media frames these developments. News that Trump is struggling in a state he previously carried becomes a headline, a talking point, and a storyline that resonates with voters far beyond the state itself. The image of a once secure leader facing cracks in his armor is powerful. It influences undecided voters who may be swayed by perceptions of strength and electability. When headlines suggest that Trump is vulnerable in states that he once claimed as proof of his dominance, it creates a psychological opening for his opponents to present themselves as viable alternatives. The media cycle feeds on vulnerability, and once it begins, it becomes difficult to contain. For Trump, who has always thrived on projecting strength and inevitability, the symbolism of trouble in a battleground state is particularly damaging. His political persona is built around the idea that he can defy expectations, beat the odds, and energize forgotten voters. But when those very voters begin to shift away, even slightly, it undermines the myth he has cultivated. Nationally, it suggests that his coalition may not be as durable as he claims. It also energizes his opponents, who see an opportunity to exploit weaknesses in his strategy and expand their reach into areas once considered unwinnable. Another layer of national implication comes from the way campaigns allocate resources. Battleground states are already expensive, requiring massive investments in advertising, ground operations, and get-out-the-vote efforts. If Trump's team finds itself forced to defend a state he barely won, it means diverting resources that might have been used to expand into new territory or solidify stronger states. Campaigns operate on finite budgets of time, money, and energy. Having to fight harder for a state that should have been relatively secure creates a cascading effect, weakening efforts elsewhere. Opponents understand this dynamic well and often focus pressure on fragile states precisely because of the drain it causes on a candidate's broader strategy. National donors and party insiders also pay attention to these signals. When warning signs emerge from a key battleground, donors may become hesitant, questioning whether their money will be well spent. Party leaders may begin to hedge their support, considering how to protect other candidates down the ballot if Trump's struggles create vulnerabilities. In politics, perception often becomes reality, and once doubts take hold at the national level, they can create real consequences in fundraising, endorsements, and party unity. Trouble in a battleground state also influences down-ballot races, which in turn shape national politics. Senators, governors, and congressional representatives often share the ballot with presidential candidates, and their chances rise or fall with the national tide. If Trump is seen as faltering in a key state, it can depress enthusiasm among Republican voters or energize Democratic turnout, reshaping the balance of power not only in the state but also in Washington. The national implications, therefore, extend far beyond Trump's personal ambitions, affecting the strategies of both parties as they seek to control Congress and state legislatures. Voter psychology plays another role in amplifying the national consequences of local struggles. Many voters want to back a winner, and when they sense that a candidate is losing steam, they reconsider their choices. Momentum and confidence can be as influential as policy positions, especially among undecided voters. If the narrative develops that Trump is in trouble in states he once carried, it creates a bandwagon effect for his opponents and makes it harder for him to regain ground elsewhere. This psychological shift is subtle but powerful, shaping the attitudes of millions who may not follow politics closely but respond strongly to perceptions of who is winning and who is losing. The national implications also touch on the broader ideological battles in American politics. Trump's movement has always positioned itself as a populist uprising against the establishment. Struggles in battleground states challenge that narrative by showing that the populist coalition is not immune to erosion. If the movement loses ground where it once found surprising success, it raises questions about its staying power. Nationally, this could open the door for alternative movements within the Republican Party or give Democrats renewed confidence that they can not only win but build durable coalitions of their own. The fragility of Trump's hold on battleground states also highlights the shifting fault lines in American politics. Urban areas continue to grow more liberal, suburban areas are trending away from Republicans, and rural areas, while still strongly supportive of Trump, cannot always provide enough votes to offset the changes elsewhere. These patterns are not confined to one state, they are national trends playing out across the map. Trouble in one state signals similar vulnerabilities in others, creating a domino effect that threatens Trump's entire path to victory. Perhaps most importantly, the national implications of losing ground in a state he barely won point to the limits of Trump's strategy of relying heavily on loyalty and grievance politics. While that approach has galvanized his base, it has struggled to expand beyond it. In a political landscape where margins are often razor-thin, failing to grow a coalition means risking collapse when even a few thousand voters shift their allegiance. Nationally, this lesson resonates not only for Trump but for every politician watching his trajectory, reminding them that in modern American politics, no coalition is secure, no margin is guaranteed, and every battleground state carries consequences that stretch far beyond its borders.